In 1893, a German anatomist published a list, a confident, carefully documented list of 86 parts of the human body that he declared completely useless: evolutionary leftovers, biological clutter, remnants of our animal ancestors that modern humans no longer needed. That list was taught in medical schools, printed in textbooks, and based on that list, millions of perfectly healthy biological structures were removed from millions of human bodies. Removed casually, removed without hesitation, removed with complete certainty that their absence would cost nothing. But here is what nobody told you. When modern biology finally developed the tools to look properly, at the molecular level, the cellular level, it kept finding the same thing. These organs were not useless. They were never useless. They were operating in dimensions that 19th century science simply could not see. And what their removal actually cost, quietly, across decades, is a story medicine is only now beginning to tell honestly. Today we are going to look at 3 of those organs, not the comfortable version of this story, the honest one, the one that tells you exactly what was lost and exactly who paid the price. Let us start with the appendix, the organ most likely to have already been removed from someone sitting next to you right now. For over a century, the appendix was understood as a liability. It gets infected, it inflames, it ruptures. Appendectomies became one of the most commonly performed surgeries on the planet. The appendix was treated as a factory defect, a biological mistake that evolution had simply forgotten to correct. Then, in 2007, researchers at Duke University published findings that quietly demolished that assumption entirely. The appendix is not a random sack of leftover tissue. It is a strategically positioned biological safe house, specifically designed to protect one of the most important systems in your body. A system that, at the time surgeons were casually removing the appendix, nobody understood well enough to connect to it at all. Your gut microbiome, the ecosystem of trillions of microorganisms living in your digestive system, is not just about digestion. It regulates your immune system. It produces serotonin, the molecule most connected to your mood and emotional stability. It influences inflammation levels throughout your entire body, connecting gut health to conditions ranging from depression to cardiovascular disease to neurological disorders. Researchers now call it the second brain, and it is fragile. Severe illness, certain infections, aggressive antibiotics, any of these can devastate the microbiome within days. When that devastation happens, when the microbiome is effectively wiped out, the body needs a way to rebuild it. A seed stock, a reserve population. That is exactly what the appendix provides. Positioned at the precise junction of the small and large intestine, tucked into a protected anatomical alcove that shields it from the disruption happening upstream during illness, the appendix cultivates and maintains a reserve population of beneficial bacteria. When the gut ecosystem collapses, the appendix releases its stored population into the recovering system, providing the foundation the microbiome needs to rebuild. It is not a useless sac. It is a biological seed vault, the backup drive for one of the most consequential systems in your body. And removing it had a cost that nobody warned anyone about. Studies found that people without an appendix showed measurably different gut microbiome profiles, less diversity, slower recovery after disruption, different bacterial distributions. Some research connected appendix removal to elevated rates of infections and immune conditions in the decades following surgery. The body compensates, it always does. But compensation is not the same as having the original system intact. The backup drive was removed from millions of people because nobody knew it was a backup drive, and some people are still paying that cost today. But the appendix is not the most uncomfortable story here, not even close. The tonsils have a history so routine, so widespread, so casually confident in its assumptions that the scale of it is genuinely difficult to absorb. At the peak of tonsillectomy culture, the 1950s through the 1980s, having your tonsils removed was almost a standard event in childhood across the developed world. Doctors recommended it at the first sign of recurrent infection. Parents accepted it without question. The procedure was minor. The recovery was quick. And since the medical consensus was unanimous that tonsils served no essential function, the decision seemed obvious. The cost was invisible, which is exactly why it was never discussed. Tonsils are lymphoid tissue, active living components of the lymphatic system, one of the body's primary immune defense networks, and their position in the throat is not coincidental. It is strategic. Everything you breathe passes them. Everything you eat and drink passes them. Every microorganism, every environmental particle, every potential pathogen entering your body through your mouth and nose. It all moves past the tonsils first. This positioning is deliberate. The tonsils are biological sentinels stationed at the body's first checkpoint. Their job is to sample the constant incoming flow, identify threats at the earliest possible point of entry, and initiate immune responses before those threats penetrate deeper into the body. The deep crypts and folds in tonsil tissue, the very features that make tonsils prone to infection, are not design flaws. They increase the surface area available for sampling, allowing the tonsils to interact with a far larger volume of incoming material than a smooth surface ever could. The feature that made tonsils look problematic was actually the feature that made them functional. And here is what removing them actually cost. Children who had their tonsils removed before age 9 showed measurably different immune profiles as adults, elevated rates of respiratory conditions, higher incidence of allergic responses, differences in autoimmune markers that persisted for decades after the procedure, because the tonsils are not just defense structures. During childhood, they are training facilities. They are where the immune system receives its earliest and most critical education. Learning which organisms are threats, which are harmless, how to calibrate its responses to the world it is living in. Remove the training facility during the most critical phase of training, and the education is permanently incomplete. Not catastrophically, not in a way that announces itself clearly on a blood test the following week, but measurably, detectably, consequentially incomplete, in ways that show up across a lifetime as a defense system that is slightly less capable, slightly more prone to errors than it would have been otherwise. Millions of tonsillectomies, millions of immune systems that learned less than they should have, and nobody told the patients, because nobody knew. Now the third organ, and this one is different, because its underestimation was not about declaring it useless, it was more subtle, more modern, and in some ways more shocking. The spleen was never called useless. Its role in filtering damaged red blood cells was understood. Its housing of immune cells was documented. People who lost their spleen could survive. Other organs compensated for most of its known functions. So the official position for most of the 20th century was not useless. It was replaceable, non-essential in the ways that ultimately mattered, an acceptable trade-off in the context of serious trauma. Then in 2009, researchers at Massachusetts General Hospital published findings that rewrote everything. What they found was that the spleen contains a reservoir of monocytes, a critical type of white blood cell essential for immune response and tissue repair, roughly twice the size of the entire monocyte population circulating in the bloodstream at any given moment. The spleen is not passively storing these cells. It is actively maintaining them in a standby state, charged, positioned, ready for immediate deployment the moment a specific biological signal arrives. When that signal arrives, when the body detects acute tissue injury, the spleen responds not over hours, but over minutes. Within minutes of cardiac injury, the spleen released its stored monocyte population into the bloodstream, flooding damaged tissue with repair cells at a rate completely impossible to achieve through normal bone marrow production on that timeline. Think about what that means precisely. When a person has a heart attack, the assumption was that the immune repair response ramped up gradually over hours as the bone marrow produced more cells and the existing circulation mobilized. What the spleen provides is something categorically different: an emergency surge, a pre-positioned reserve force deployed in minutes before the bone marrow has even had time to receive the signal. The difference between a minute-scale repair response and an hour-scale repair response in cardiac damage is not a minor footnote. It is the difference between how much heart muscle dies permanently and how much survives. It is the difference between the degree of damage sustained and the degree of recovery that becomes possible. The spleen is not a support player. It is a first responder, a pre-charged emergency immune battery, stationed, loaded, and waiting. And science missed this entirely for over a century because it was looking at what the spleen did under normal conditions. Emergency systems do not reveal themselves during normal conditions. A system that is never triggered looks exactly like a system that does nothing until the emergency arrives and the system is no longer there. Now step back from the individual organs. because the pattern connecting all three of them is more important than any single finding. Wiedersheim in 1893 was not a bad scientist. He was careful, systematic, genuinely accomplished. His error was not in his methods, his error was in the assumption built into his question. He asked, "What does this part do?" He did not ask, "What does this part do under conditions we have not yet tested? What does this part do in the emergency scenarios that are hardest to observe? What does this part do at a biological scale our instruments cannot yet reach?" He asked the simpler question, and the simpler question produced a confident, incomplete answer. That answer, institutionally embedded, medically acted upon, shaped surgical decisions for 100 years. Here is what that pattern should permanently change about how you think. Natural selection eliminates everything that costs more than it contributes. It maintains nothing out of inertia or accident. Every cell in your body requires resources to build and maintain. Evolution does not pay those costs for structures that offer nothing in return. If a structure survived millions of years of that process, it was earning its place. The honest position is not useless. It is not yet understood. Those are very different conclusions, and the history of medicine discovering that difference, one dismissed organ at a time, is a long, expensive, sometimes irreversible argument for choosing the second one before reaching for the scalpel. None of this means every appendectomy was a mistake, or every tonsillectomy caused measurable harm. Medicine operated with the information it had, and many of those operations saved lives that would otherwise have been lost. That matters, and it is not being dismissed. What is being said is more precise than that. The human body is more sophisticated, more deliberately constructed by evolution, and more functionally layered than any generation before this one has fully understood. The parts that look most useless, dismissed in textbooks, removed without hesitation, are consistently the ones with the most important story still waiting to be told. The appendix was a seed vault nobody knew existed. The tonsils were a training facility nobody knew was running. The spleen was a first responder nobody knew was stationed there. All three were doing critical work. All three did it invisibly, right up until the moment they were removed. Your body has been refined by 4 billion years of evolutionary pressure. Nothing in it was maintained by accident. Nothing was preserved without reason. And the complexity you cannot yet see is not the complexity that does not exist. The next video goes further. We are going to look at the specific ways your body is still running programs written for a world that no longer exists, and what that mismatch costs you every single day without you knowing where the cost is coming from. Stay curious, stay informed, and treat your biology with the respect it has earned.